Hi all, Toby here, week 14. This is just going to be a quick 25-minute summary of the unit and what we were trying to do and how we were trying to do it. We were trying to explore the idea of history not as something that happened to objects, but as something that continues to happen to objects, and the way in which artists in particular have led the charge towards creating a new attitude towards history, an attitude that is inclusive, diverse, one that challenges the orthodoxies of the past. And part of that, which is written in the blurb here, is exploring our continued connectivity with the past, but to explore it within ways that are generative, that we're not trying to just replicate history or repeat it. We're just trying to, in some ways, to see how we are entangled by history, its ideologies, its empires, its canons, etc. Whilst I myself am very fond of art history, the purpose of this unit was not to treat art history as something that is to be revered, that we should be referential to, nor is it something that should be dominated by the Western canon, nor is it resolved, nor is it apolitical or ungendered. And in particular, what we're interested here in this unit is the way in which artists have proposed a sense of differencing, a diverse, unresolved and global histories of art. So we're just going to very quickly take you through some of the things that we looked at. I can't obviously cover everything. All of the lectures are available on the Milo for those of you who need a little bit of reminder and a little bit more further context. In week 1, we explored the whole idea of canon, a standard or a rule, particularly based around the idea of religious acceptance of writings, for instance. And the canon was established not particularly by scholars or artists, but it was established precisely in order as a struggle for power. Now, there's no single art historical canon around on which all things are based, and indeed many of them have national ideas. Okay, so there was a canon of Australian art, for instance, a canon of French art. And it's constantly in competition with other canons, constantly being revised. Which happened first? Where did it happen? And who by? We also have canons of specific media, a canon of painting, a canon of drawing, for instance. And it's not just artists and writers, but it's also through a range of technologies of influence. So, in particular, I wanted to emphasize the fact that we often absorb an idea of the artistic canon through contemporary media, not just The Simpsons and Family Guy, but through the buildings that we walk past, through the books that we read, through visual culture, the t-shirts and the tea towels that we have hanging around our house. But this drive towards power and organisation and history is not something that was just located in art of the past. Many of its logic, the idea of genealogies and setting things out in terms of spheres of influence, continue today. This is both, of course, when we reproduce the logic can be quite dangerous. We often reproduce the same errors of the past. So when we write about contemporary graffiti or street art, there's something quite troubling, but also quite interesting in that trouble, relating to the fact that the logic of the past has been reproduced in the present. But we're interested in about how contemporary artists in particular have sought to try to disrupt or disturb this canon by throwing in some absurdities, by throwing in points of connection that has otherwise not been seen, but also in terms of looking at its frameworks and its instruments. But let's not forget that the canon and the idea of a canon remains large. But one thing that we try to look at are some of the different strategies employed by artists and thinkers to try to break this canon down, to try to observe it and to try to intervene. We saw, for instance, that all too often whenever we offer a more inclusive idea of a canon, we're still placing artists, whether they be First Nation, women, non-male, non-white, non-Western, unconforming arts. Though we may invite them into the space, they are still very much outside. They are still isolated. They're recognised, but certainly not as equals. They're protected, but they're certainly not embraced. In week 1, we looked at two distinct ideas, feminism and decolonisation. We looked at feminism as an encountering of the canon of the structure of exclusion. Okay? Bring women into the museum, bring women into art history. We also saw about how feminist artists in particular sought to subvert the domination of marginalizations, whether it be subverting images, in the case of Rosemary Truckle's knitted flag, but also just to subvert our understanding of materials and forms, etc. And finally, we saw feminism as a way of really introducing whole new sets of discursive strategies and the reproductions of sexual difference. So in studying feminist art, it's not just about art of women, it's about how we construct the idea of women. And it's particularly around structuring our responses along the lines of man, woman, and of course queering comes into this, of course. And it's about challenging cis heteronormativity. The idea of the white woman artist is of course very different from the idea of the white non-woman artist. And then once we add into new ideas such as queering and pluralities and intersectionalities, it gets particularly interesting as a way of thinking around how structures of identities and structures of art are formed. We also considered in week one decolonising strategies. In particular, we looked over a couple of weeks at the work of Brooke Andrew. Brooke Andrew is a First Nations artist based in Victoria now, and Brooke Andrew explores a whole new sets of decolonising strategies. And the point of decolonisation, which is somewhat different from post-colonisation, is the one in which we see our responses to history as being one that's deeply entangled. Okay, our relationships to empire, to colony, to capital, to gender are not easily unpicked. We see them and we feel them. So the study of history within a decolonising context is not to try to somehow remove work from this empire of influence, but rather to see, these are living, surviving cultures who continue to be disadvantaged, continue to be affected by the results of empire and patriarchy and capital. And so Brooke Andrews' work seeks to examine those entanglements. Okay, so here he's kind of examining the layering of colonisation, of technology, of photography, but also of Australia as well, and what we understand to be Australia. Okay. So in week one, we tried to examine some of these differencing strategies, feminist and decolonising. In week two, we started to look at some of those other institutions, museums and galleries that seek to organise ideas, but also seek to work ideologically. What can be said, for instance, in terms of the structures and layouts of our national museums and what it reveals to us around certain tensions about what to say and what to do with the work of First Nations artists. And of course, we can examine a whole different range of different responses. But we looked at it also through an historical lens to see how museums have always served ideas of nation, but also ideas of gender too. And we looked at the idea of the Louvre in particular, about the way in which key works and the idea of France was presented so prominently that even work that was not French was always presented in relationship to France. Art galleries don't just display works of art. They show, above all, our perceptions of it. And they're attempting to unify a place, they're attempting to make connection between collections and the work of the canon. And they exist as sites of ideology. Okay? But this is not necessarily something that is of old survey museums and national galleries, for instance. The emergence of the white cube space in the second half of the 20th century was no less ideological. But whereas the pre-white cube, those national museums and galleries, sought to be temples of the nation, the white cube just replaced one set of privileges, that of nation, with another set of privileges, art. The white cube, rather than serving national interests, served the interests of art itself, tried to extract art from that entanglement. So it wasn't necessarily a move to neutralise art, although some people would make that claim, but rather to see about how we just replaced the logic of one place with another. And week 4 was particularly challenging. We looked at the question of Australian art, or rather, as I suggested, the idea that there's no such thing as Australian art. And what I mean by that is that Australia is, as we know, a site of many conflicting histories and ideas, many layers, many of which are entangled within very difficult and traumatizing genocidal politics. And we saw in particular how a whole broad range of contemporary exhibitions, many of them still going on today, have sought to examine these questions of what exactly is Australian art, if indeed if it is such a thing at all. Here at the Buxton Contemporary in Melbourne, still going on today. Here at Artspace in Sydney. But also we looked at the way in which contemporary artists have tried to explore reframing the arts of these places within new global histories. Australian art is both European but also increasingly Asian Pacific. We saw how the works of First Nations curators and artists have sought to, in particular, serve to dissect and antagonise certain sets of cultural, political and economic relationships. From Australia being both part of Eurovision but also being part of the Asia Pacific Soccer Cup just reveals a set of tensions. And again, the work of Brooke Andrew seeks to look at these entanglements and these collisions. But this isn't just the concerns of First Nations artists, although they have, in a very powerful way, led so many of these sets of inquiries. Here we have, and I make an absolute apology for presenting the work of First Nations artists against those of non, but I do so quite provocatively, with the idea to say that these questions of is there such a thing as an Australian art is one that continues to pervade our contemporary culture. Terry Smith, an SA historian, we kind of considered him with the idea of Australia as a provincial place. Okay? Australia had retreated from considerable confidence, a site of great opportunity, a great sense in which we could re-establish new sets of cultures, through to, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, a space of real belatedness, a space that was second-hand, was always some period after tyrannies of distance and time, that Australian art had retreated from that confidence into paranoia. And the question that I proposed is that still very much the case? Week 6, Chris Clark gave a fantastic presentation, in particular focusing on the work of Matthew Buckingham, and looking at a range of different strategies of the ways in which artists have constituted history. History not just as one thing after another, but history that might serve various anachronisms, that history might not be something that is happening in the past in the image, but may also be the future of the image, and which he proposed a whole different set of new types of dialogues and structures for the way in which we think about it. In week 7, we were delighted to welcome Zoe Rimmer from TMAG and Julie Goff, also from TMAG, to present a whole different range of the ways in which First Nations artists, particularly Tasmanian Aboriginal artists and curators, have sought to try to reframe these collections and the connections, not just through curatorial practices, but through artistic interventions. It was an incredibly lively lecture. It was incredibly inspiring to see how Tasmania has, in the last 15-20 years, gone from a place of very poor practices in terms of recognitions of First Nations artists through to actually leading the way. And of course, we know that Julie Goff's work in particular, and the work of Lola Greeno in the north, has really led the way in terms of nationally thinking around the significance and the ongoing practices of history. History as something that survives, but that also history is something that continues to try to intervene with objects and artefacts. In week 8, we welcomed Dr. Imogen Wegman, who an expert in cartographies, who explored the way in which maps, and in particular historical maps, have not so much shaped our idea of place, but they kind of, in many ways, create place. Okay, so it isn't so much that maps tell us the story of a nation. Maps also tell us what an idea of that nation is, what is recorded, what is not recorded, for instance. Week 9, we looked at our Making History task, and in week 10 I returned with the idea of a manifesto. The manifesto is something that I used Solowitz's sentences on conceptual art, as a way of provoking why is it that we're looking at these things, and about how structures of thinking, and in particular conceptual art, can continue to provide us with a way to think around what our responses to history might be. They might be transcriptions, they might be remediations, they might be based around subject or theme, but also materials and forms, and that all of these have value. So just some conclusions then. This unit sought to understand better how history can be understood as a set of changing relationships. And in particular, we were focusing on how artists have employed ideas and instruments of history in their work to explore how we form and share stories. We were interested in artists first and foremost, and we were interested in artists that, in particular, that have led a whole series of interventions, feminist, decolonising, queering, that have brought new understanding to the role of art and its institutions in the modern world. Because, after all, as Karl Marx says, the point is not just to interpret the world, but to change it. And they often have been. And there was certainly some value in including them, but also at the same time, including somebody is not the same as embracing them. Nor is it an erosion necessarily of your sites of privilege, which remain white and male.